Okay, you can start.
Awesome. Thank you, Ivan. Brilliant. So I'd like to welcome the observers, debaters, coaches, and judges here with us today. Good morning, afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the quarterfinals today. The motion for the debate today reads, this House believes that governments should end all direct international aid and donate money to non-governmental organizations, e.g. Oxfam or Médecins Sans Frontières instead. On the proposition side of the House today, we have Team USAD, Team Red, and on the opposition side of the House, we have Hong Kong WSDC. What I'm going to ask for very briefly is just for the benefit of the debaters, observers, and coaches that the judges very quickly introduce themselves. Judges, just for simplicity's sake, can we go by the order on the break sheet, please?
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Hui Min. Good luck for the debate.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan. Good luck to everyone, and congrats for making it this far.
Hello, I'm Laura, and congrats and good luck in this round as well.
Hi, my name is Kyle. Congrats to both teams and good luck to them as well.
Thank you very much, judges. Two last things from me, sorry. In terms of timekeeping, just to make everyone in the room aware, I will keep my mic on at 1 minute and 7 minutes. I'll also have my video on. You will see the one clap. You should also be able to hear it. At 8 minutes, I will also indicate a double clap. At 8 minutes 20, I'll indicate a final double clap, at which point myself and judges, please stop listening. Lastly, can I just ask both proposition and opposition teams to very briefly tell me which order they're speaking in, once again, for the benefit of the observers and judges. We'll start with Team Prop. First speaker, please.
First speaker, Susanna Ahmed.
The second speaker in reply is Max Perrin.
And the third speaker is Diego Castillo.
Thank you, proposition team. And now Op.
So on 01, we have Madeline. 02 in reply will be Jenna, and 03 is Davis.
Thank you, opposition team. With that being said, I would like to invite the proposition first speaker to open the quarterfinals. Here.
For POIs, if it's okay, I'd like just to have visual POIs. So just raise your hand or a card. The job of international aid is to provide money without having intentions of forwarding the country's political agenda. The job of international aid is to help out communities in countries that are in immense need of it, not to fund corrupt governments. Because we believe that aid should always be given out to vulnerable groups who have been impacted instead of feeding the political incentives of the global arena, we are so proud to propose. In my speech, I'll be doing a few things. First, a few points on framing. They'll be introducing the first two substantive arguments as side proposition. But now onto framing. For definitions of direct international aid. This term is defined as instances of aid between two parties where one does not benefit directly. This means that we are not talking about foreign military assistance under this umbrella term because one country sends in their military into another country. It almost always for the security benefits of both. This is a military decision, not foreign aid. This means we are also not talking about economic development programs such as BRI because China is benefiting from it, making it an economic policy, not foreign aid. Lastly, we believe that regardless of precise wording, the fact that the motion lists two examples of exclusively humanitarian organizations means that this debate is primarily about whether governments should be providing relief assistance and supplies to other governments to give to their people, or whether NGOs should be providing humanitarian aid directly to their people. We think that NGOs are primarily non-for-profit humanitarian organizations like Oxfam, like Red Cross, like Pacific Community, like sub-branches of larger organizations like the United Nations Children Fund are also highly relevant. Because we believe that NGOs like the IMF or the African Development Bank Group are less relevant because, again, they deal primarily in the developmental loans and assistance with strings attached rather than aid. Thus, 3 points to frame this debate. As we outlined above, this debate should only be about humanitarian aid, like sending in food or medicine directly to people in an area of conflict. This debate is not about who has more money, governments or NGOs, because the motion specifies the same amount of money exists in either world. In opposition, it's split between NGOs and global governments, and proposition, it's entirely with NGOs. We defend a world where governments provide blank checks and supplies and NGOs to use to aid that they see fit in order to best disengage national powers from the decision-making process. With that, let's go on to our first substantive argument. Aid should be detached from international politics. Our first layer, principle of egalitarian assistance. All countries in the world have benefited to some degree from the resources, environments, populations, and other nations of the world. Thus, when superpowers like the US or China provide humanitarian assistance to other regions or nations, that assistance is the form of repayment for the power states have required. Thus, it should operate independently of power politics. Direct international aid in the status quo violates this principle, as it almost always functions as the extension of national interests. When the US selectively chose nations to give developmental assistance after World War II to help build a global empire, or selectively refused aid to nations like Chile or Argentina suffering from humanitarian crisis on grounds of their communist ideologies, we saw that national interest driving crisis on the grounds of these types of aid. We saw this very detrimental at the end of the day, because when countries across the globe selectively provide just enough aid to allies to fulfill commitments outlined in treaties, we see national interest driving this aid. Why does proposition rectify this violation? As we outlined in our model, governments would not give aid to NGOs with an asterisk of purpose of money, but rather aid would be provided as blank checks that NGOs could use in whatever way best protected the most vulnerable, thus filling the duty we outlined. While governments have a primary duty of protecting interests of their people and the survival of their state, humanitarian NGOs like Oxfam have primary purpose of the global well-being. This separates humanitarian assistance from power politics, which is principally just. This principal argument operates on a higher layer than every practical opposing argument, because it begs the question of whether large nations have the jurisdiction to provide exclusively government-to-government aid in the first place. Insofar as the way to determine the consequences matter is dependent on the principle we value, resolving principled arguments is a prerequisite to other concerns. Our second layer is the effective distribution of resources. The most significant difference between governments and NGOs as givers of aid is incentive analysis, as we explained above. While humanitarian organizations have the primary purpose of bettering the vulnerable, national governments that give aid have higher national interests. This is bad for two main reasons. First is selective distribution. When governments directly provide aid, they have selective interest in who they give aid to on the basis of ideological and strategic similarities. The example of Western nations refusing disaster relief to communist nations during and after Cold War, even though humanitarian assistance should have nothing to do with military and political alliances and how national interests are harming the marginalized. Second is dangerous caveats. Since the direct assistance is often pursued as the means of increasing international clout and power, many nations choose on how to grant aid if they believe they benefit in some way from this arrangement. This looks like Chinese humanitarian assistance with the implicit condition that the nation must later agree to a larger trade deals, or the US providing disaster relief after World War II or in post-conflict societies with the implicit condition that basing in military deployments will remain in the region after the crisis has been ended. While these arrangements may benefit the United States, the presence of military force among local populations often causes greater conflict. Why is our comparative much more preferable? Because massive swaths of NGOs funding coming from private donors, and even if they receive substantial funds from nations in our world, that money comes from numerous nations. No one nation controls a large enough portion of the budget to overpower an NGO's agenda, and international backlash to a country for skipping on their aid would reduce countries' leverage over NGOs because their threats will be hollow. Thus, NGOs won't be held to the national incentives and pressures we described. Our second substantive argument is national governments in times of crisis are ineffective at distributing aid. The thesis of the substantive is that the involvement of two governments creates barriers to efficient distribution of aid. 3 reasons as to why this is true. First is corrupt governments. It is extremely likely that nations with corrupt governments are most likely to be in need of humanitarian aid, as it is with people within these nations that are often denied necessities, i.e., this looks like Venezuela neglecting adequate distribution of resources and money, which results in the capital Caracas thriving because the rest of the nation is suffering. Leaders who use this rhetoric often deny as they view it as a threat to their own power of influence, which means that the material quality of life and the people within the country never improves. This is exactly why Maduro refused to let aid enter Venezuela. Preferred NGOs because they are likely incapable of giving aid directly to people within these nations, which cuts out of the two middlemen, which are the governments giving aid and the governments receiving this aid. Second is ineffective governments. Giving countries aid is contingent upon those governments being able to adequately distribute this aid. These governments are likely ineffective for two reasons. One, countries are in need of aid because they are unable to handle these situations by themselves. In this instance, it is most formerly colonized or oppressed nations, which makes it less likely that the infrastructure or funding the distributes themselves. Secondly, the government has other extremely important roles, i.e. welfare, bureaucracy, etc., all of which is expensive and zero sum. Thus, you prefer NGOs because this literally is their entire goal in the point of their existence. They are highly specialized and likely to be more effective. And secondly, like the political and financial capital of individual governments is zero sum, allowing for NGOs to be in charge of distributing aid allows for the governments to better fulfill their roles. Thirdly, we have anti-Western sentiment. We have negative perceptions of the US and the West. Countries which have previously faced oppression at the hands of Western countries often deny Western aid as symbolic and rhetorical measures. Therefore, the West, including countries like the US, give out aid to countries. Many individuals associate this aid as being specific ideals of these countries. Therefore, we are so proud to urge for a proposition ballot.
I thank the proposition first speaker for their speech and would like to invite the opposition first speaker to open the case for side up. Hear, hear.
So for all speakers and team opposition, we would prefer audible PLS. If this debate were to only be about sending food and medicine, then governments don't have a direct interest to hoard them, because having 2 trucks of bread doesn't do anything to benefit the corrupt government they want to paint. If this debate were to only be about such, Team USA has ultimately dangerously crossed the line, because if they agree with us that things like school program, health facilities still need facilitation by the government, we think to some extent they have crossed the line. If their model for us is a global charity and prioritizing based on global needs, they have to explain to us why the US will now be willing to donate to such a vague cause where the money can possibly go to their political opponents. The fact that they haven't recognized that, we think, is largely dangerous for side proposition. 2 responses before I move on to 2 points in our case. 1, on why we are the only side where governments are able to perform necessary projects that NGOs cannot, and 2, why NGOs are often poor decision makers and are inefficient. My second speaker will then talk about hostility from governments. Before that, what exactly do we stand for? We stand for, and we're happy to support, a mix of governments directly providing aid to other governments, and in some cases, governments providing aid to NGOs. Essentially, we think this is the status quo. Next, let's go into 2 responses. The first response I would like to address is on the idea on how the comparative becomes a corrupt and politicized government versus a non-profit, non-political, and a global interested NGO. Because recognize that if their model is that this is a global thing, we think people in general will care much less, and because it is too vague for the individual to understand it is too vague for governments to understand what they are actually donating to. Because what actually are you donating for? This isn't clear on their side of the house. If you are asked to donate to help the genocide in Myanmar, that's far clearer for people to have the incentive, or for governments to have this incentive to donate. You need the human narrative, and they strip that away on their side of the house. But secondly, on both sides of the House, we think on their side of the House actually, governments are still likely to deny giving aid if it were to go to their political opponents. This debate isn't about whether or not it actually goes to their political opponents, but rather the fact that it may go to their political opponents is one that is
Points.
that deters countries from wanting to provide aid in the first place. We don't think the US will simply donate because they're not sure whether the money actually goes to China or Ukraine. They have to deal with that on their side of the House.
Information.
Donations largely decrease, and they have to deal with that very problem if they want to help people. Thirdly, on corrupt governments, we say on our side, we're happy to support the fact that if governments have terrible records with aid, we're just not going to give these governments aid until they fix the problem. Second response, why governments are highly ineffective on their side versus their claim that governments are highly ineffective versus NGOs being specialized. Recognize that their case is arguing directly against what they want to say. Because if they want to be against this, then they won't be able to make the NGO that is global. Because if an NGO is global, how exactly are you specialized? Because we don't think that makes sense in their side of the House. But I'll directly clash with this in my second substantive. Moving on, first substantive. Why are only governments able to perform necessary projects that NGOs cannot? The premise of this argument is that many receivers of development aid often cannot be saved through shipping a couple of trucks of food or building 3 schools around a village. What these nations need are long-term planning, like large-scale citywide planning in systematic orders through planning the mass building of schools, healthcare, and infrastructure. This is crucial for development because these are all necessary for long-term change where people are no longer left helpless on the ground after food banks run out, after cash handouts are exhausted, and when schools no longer have the maintenance fees to keep running. Why are governments uniquely the actors that are capable to do so? One, because all of these things intrinsically need government planning, policy planning, and you need the data of a country's population, their conditions, which are often largely and only accessible by those governments. And on their side of the House, even if NGOs have the will and the incentive to do this, they will still need to collaborate with the governments to facilitate it. So it is still largely not going to be independently run by NGOs, and the impact is that it will still be highly inefficient on their side of the House. But even if that is not the case, Mr. Speaker, why do governments still have more incentive to do so than NGOs? Because we think NGOs in the status quo are likely to exist as short-term emergency alleviations. For example, to solve things like famine through creating food banks, to do things like malaria, right? You can report on this is the case because these organizations can report on their contributions of their work, i.e. for each meal they provide, they save a child for a day. Or you can save or promote things like you can save 3 children a day for only $1. They are not there to create the robust healthcare system that is often needed. We think, moreover, once a charity has gotten a place out of crisis, they're likely to leave the area and go to the next trendy place that has another crisis. And that is what they want to claim on their side, that they're going to prioritize global needs. We think this is highly unsustainable because the medical clinics that were previously running can no longer be operating when foreign doctors leave. The schools are forced to shut down because they no longer have funding in general. Therefore, on their side of the House, they don't get long-term development. They're likely to slip back into crisis and fall back to the same problem they started off with. Moreover, we say given the government is the only actor who is willing to care about long-term development, because better education often directly means you have a more productive population, which stimulates the economy. Better healthcare means that an area has a higher awareness of disease and has better management to diseases to reduce risks of plagues detrimenting society, which screws over economies. They're held to account by the ballot box because governments need to appeal to people. NGOs need to appeal to donors. Foreign donors who have never set foot on the areas they're donating towards. Proposition doesn't achieve this long-term development that they ought to achieve. Second argument, why NGOs are poor decision makers and are inefficient. Before that, I'll take a point.
I'd like to clarify one of your earlier stances about the incentive structures of countries like the United States. You say they're not willing to threat giving aid to foreign enemies. I'm curious, if you give aid to, let's suppose, the Red Cross that uses that aid to help citizens who are starving in North Korea, how is that analogous to giving military assistance or helping a political opponent, i.e. the North Korean government?
We never said that's okay on our side, but furthermore, we think on your side of the House, you also have to defend that because given how vague your model is set, we think it's a lot more likely that the governments are not going to donate. Second argument is why NGOs are poor decision makers and are highly inefficient. Why is this the case? Few reasons. One, poor allocations of spending, because you have to advertise as an NGO to appeal to the private donors or show governments now that they should be invested in. Versus on our side, governments are the default place you donate to as another government, so you do not need to do all of these things like ads and promotion, which actually is a very, very high proportion of these NGOs' budgets. Secondly, because NGOs often have a distorted perception of local areas, because you have to appeal to the foreign donors as governments instead of the people who live there. Foreign donors donate because they like to feel good about themselves, i.e., I'm saving 2 children today instead of I'm contributing to a 20-year plan to increase literacy rates. NGOs look good when they say that they are helping people and they're saving lives. What is the impact of this? 2 things. 1, this means that these NGOs are less likely to listen to local people's concerns. And we think this is important because what they need should be coming from them and not from people who don't know them well. Second, they're more likely to just build the schools for these areas instead of teach them how to do so. Teach them how to run a sustainable program, which we think is harmful because once they leave, these people go. Ultimately, in a world where charities don't have the locals' best interests at heart, and even if they do not know how to provide for them and cannot do so, we say this isn't a world side opposition is willing to stand for.
I'd like to thank the opposition first speaker for his speech and invite the proposition second speaker for theirs. Hear, hear.
I prefer verbal POIs if possible. Side opposition paints our imagination of NGOs that specialize globally, that focus on providing assistance writ large and can deal with a litany of crises that extend beyond national boundaries as utopian. We would ask them, if that truly is utopian, then why are the words without borders in the organization Doctors Without Borders? We would say that the fact that NGOs have historically ignored national ties, the fact that they are willing to respond to those who are in need, regardless of who those people's political allies are across the globe, and regardless of which countries are supplying guns to their political leaders, is a reason why these organizations should be the ones saving lives rather than ones who have vested interest in increasing political capital and geopolitical power. In this speech, I'll be doing a couple of things. Firstly, framing issues to clarify what exactly both sides defend on this debate and the incentive analysis that various actors within this debate have. Then 2 key points of clash that will frame your evaluation of the round. Firstly, on framing, we would say that our model just isn't as ambiguous as we were making it out to be. We see that NGOs are those that provide humanitarian assistance. Yes, that can look like lots of things, and yes, that is more than just giving a couple of trucks of bread. It is things like building schools, providing some amount of housing assistance, building infrastructure, etc., but not the large economic style trade deals that would be established in programs like BRI. But more importantly, we think the fact that governments may not be able to directly choose where their money is going to is not a reason why the place their money is going to is a mystery. Organizations like the Red Cross, like Oxfam, like the other organizations we talked about, do not have some mysterious list of countries they give their money to. The places they help are publicized oftentimes because those are the places in the world that are facing massive humanitarian crises or disasters. When the United States gives money to Oxfam, there's not a risk that that money is going to the Russian government or to Chinese military development programs. Obviously, if it was going to an enemy state, it's not going into the hands of that state's military government. Rather, all of our arguments are about how NGOs are preferable because the money is going from the NGO to the people, insofar as the starving citizens of North Korea are not the ones who the US fears as a political opponent. We do not understand why their contextualization of how the US is afraid of giving aid to foreign enemies is at all relevant to the debate we are having. We said that the US is unlikely to give aid to foreign enemies if it has to be giving money to those states' governments, which is a reason why if there are states that do not ideologically align with the United States, like communist states in the past, even if their people are starving and need help, they will not receive aid under the opposition's world, which is a reason we think they are fundamentally unjust. But now, let's get into the 2 key points of clash in today's debate. The first is the question of principled obligations of governmental institutions, and this is where they just did not engage in their opposition first speech, did not read a counter principle, and conceded all of our weighing as to why the principle constrains your evaluation of the practical, which will be the easiest way to vote for the proposition in this debate. We have contextualized down the bench how it is the case that the way governments derive power, that the way they derive sovereignty, and the way they derive resources from the international stage is through some degree of exploitation expectation and reliance on the rest of the international arena and the rest of the world writ large, which creates some form of an obligation that they have to repay to that world writ large, not in the form of pursuing national interest or pursuing gains from themselves, but through a measure of egalitarianism. We would say that insofar as they have not contested that the way governments give aid to other governments is inherently intertwined with the giver's national interest, their pursuit of power, etc., which is evidenced by the United States' selective distribution of aid to those it views as countries it wants to ally with, and the fact that aid often comes with strings attached, i.e. China entailing larger economic trade deals that are advantageous to them after immediate aid, or the US putting military basing and strategic interests in countries after it provides aid, are evidence of how in the status quo, the aid that is occurring is not egalitarian, but in a world in which the primary mission purpose of organizations like Red Cross and other NGOs is egalitarian humanitarian distribution. In fact, it is the case that they do not get access to their funding unless they fulfill that mission. We say if governments give money to NGOs to then distribute it on their behalf, that best fulfills the principled obligation of governments. This was not contested and is a principled stance as to why you can vote for the proposition. But before I continue on to the second theme, I will take a point.
Which side is more accountable? A government whose decisions are influenced by the ballot box and who literally have to publish all their spending data to the public, or an NGO who doesn't have to do any of these?
Well, firstly, an NGO does have to publish their spending data, or at the very least, it has to indicate what the material results of its spending are. The way NGOs work, at least humanitarian ones, which this motion is talking about, is that they do not meet certain goals or are not considered to be doing certain things that is in their mission statement, then they do not get funding. In the same way that if a company does not produce profit for its shareholders, it goes under. If an NGO does not meet its mission purpose, it goes under similarly, which proves it has an incentive structure. Secondly, regardless of your analysis of what governments do, we would say that when governments are deciding where to get aid, those who are voting care about helping their nation. Therefore, they choose to give aid to countries that would help their nation, which we say is unjust. And we just don't think that governments are transparent regarding what they do with their money. Think to the Pentagon Papers. What was the US doing in Vietnam? That wasn't publicized to the people, and it led to countless atrocities, which proves the comparative question of accountability flows decisively to the proposition. But let's talk more about the second question of which side of the debate best helps those who are in need in vulnerable countries. We bring you a couple of layers analysis. Firstly, we say, even if we were to buy that it is the case that local governments are the best distributors of aid to the people, we would say that a world in which that aid is provided, or at the very least cooperatively assisted by NGOs, is far preferable than a world in which the aid is directly given from government to government. Because we would say that in a world in which the United States or other nations are giving aid directly to governments, that aid looks is in fact a lot more than things like housing assistance, like food, like hospitals, etc. Cross-apply their own analysis about how it is the case when governments provide aid to other governments, that aid in those programs exist in those countries far after the crisis is contained. What they don't mention is existing in those countries far after the crisis is contained looks like having landing platforms full of US helicopter gunships, troop deployments, and other basing that perpetuates military conflict in the region long after aid should have been ended, or at the very least long after those troops should have been removed from the region, which is why their point about sustained presence is actually a proposition argument. But secondly, we would tell you that they haven't answered the second argument that we have given you, talking about why national governments, even if we buy that they would be the ones giving aid, are uniquely bad actors for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we would indicate that their portrayal of national governments as institutions that have their people's interests at heart, so when they get money from NGOs or larger governments, they will do what they need to help their people, is simply false. Think about Maduro. When we give him resources, or when he has received resources from other institutions, he does not use that money to help his people, he uses it to cement his own power. With other dictatorships across the globe and other similar governments, we see that if money is given to them by countries like the United States to help their people, they do not buy food for their people, they buy guns to oppress their people, which is a reason why cutting out the middleman of local governments and allowing NGOs to go directly to the people to provide assistance is comparatively far preferable. We also think even if it is the case that governments are not malicious, they are often ineffective because of large bureaucratic constraints. But even if they are effective, we say that when they are intertwined with forces like the United States, and there's that militaristic element of aid that is distributed, there is backlash from the public and local militias, which makes aid in rectifying those who are in conditions of oppression difficult, which directly clashes with all of the analysis they have given you, because they said that we need policy planning and data to help out other countries. We would say that NGOs have access to that. Their job is to figure that out and decide how to give aid. And even if they don't have immediate access to that, we think that cooperation with local governments is perfectly possible in a world. We just shouldn't cede complete control over resources in humanitarian humanitarian assistance to them. We say once a charity leaves a region, they're done and won't come back. We just say this is wrong. It just doesn't make economic sense to leave all of your resources once you've spent a lot of initial startup costs setting them up. And it's also a reason as to why sustained presence is uniquely worse. For all of these reasons, we think the incentive structures of NGOs are comparatively preferable than the government's giving aid or receiving aid, which justifies a proposition ballot. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the proposition second speaker for their speech and invite the opposition second speaker for theirs. So here.
Hi, as Madeline said earlier, I'm happy with verbal POIs. I probably won't see a visual POI, so. Am I frozen? Okay. Side proposition's principle of egalitarian aid at the end of the day comes down to equally no aid for everybody. 3 points of rebuttal then before moving on into substantive on why we think their side of the house increases hostility between governments. But firstly then on the first point of rebuttal on what the distribution of aid is going to look like. Note that my substantive clash is also going to be part of this argument, but let's deal with some direct responses first. They firstly told us that there's going to be a principle about egalitarian aid. We think that our response to the principle is that it's hinged on the practical, i.e. that you're able to give aid effectively to these countries and that you're going to be able to give aid equally in the first place. Why is this not the case? Because we told you that on their side of the house, governments are still going to be able to have control over their aid. Sure, they might give it to the UN, they might give it to Red Cross, but they'll earmark it by saying, give it to this region, please, not these countries that we don't support. They're still going to have implicit conditions as a result and still be able to use it in geopolitical negotiations. We think on their side of the house, if they have the fiat to say that they're not going to be allowed to do this, then surely if we do have to fight on this principle of egalitarian aid, we can also just fiat it and say that we're going to give aid equally to all governments. We don't think that this stood at the beginning. But let's say even if governments have no control over who gets their aid, that just means you're going to get less aid in general. Why is this the case? Because we think public spending on foreign aid is already extremely unpopular with voters because no one wants to think that all my taxpayer money is going to people I don't know, thousands of miles away from me. Why isn't it going to my direct benefit in the first place? So foreign aid is already extremely unpopular. When you add, in fact, the only way it is justified right now is to say, hey, these people are our allies. These are good people who we like and trust. And we have a specific narrative about specifically what's going on in these countries that we can persuade people to get on board with. When you don't have a specific narrative because you're just giving aid generally, and there's an abstract principle of egalitarianism, it means public will drops and you have less political incentive to actually give that aid in the first place. When there's also a potential for that aid to go to people that you don't like, that is actively not in your interest to give aid to, that is when it is preferable to just not give aid at all because the default is to not give aid.
Information.
An active incentive. Then they tell us that, hey, this aid is going to go directly to the people, so the distribution is going to be really good. A bad, evil government isn't going to be able to touch this. Again, this isn't the case. If I'm the government and I have control over my own borders and I don't want to let the Red Cross in for whatever reason, I don't want some sort of Western money coming in, as they say, then I just won't let the Red Cross into my borders. On their side of the house, they have to concede. Even if you give the money to an NGO, there is still going to be some level of government permission, some level of government
information.
Analysis that, hey, the word without borders is in their title isn't analysis. The fact is governments have control over what happens in their countries. Lastly, then, they tell us that some governments are going to reject this aid because they don't want to get help from the West because they perceive the West to be their enemies. That's going to be the same on their side of the house. Disproportionately, Western countries are much wealthier. If all Western countries are now putting all their aid into UNICEF, UNICEF is now perceived, which is already perceived to be, by the way, a very Western organization. Now it is hyper-perceived to be a Western organization. They get all the same problems. Secondly, then, on rebuttal, on why we think the inefficiency and effectiveness is much, much worse. They told us that some of these governments are corrupt and ineffective. Note, firstly, that a lot of countries aren't corrupt and ineffective. We think to say that because you're not a super successful government, you must be corrupt and ineffective is pretty unfair. Like, there are a lot of reasons governments can struggle. Unfair borders being drawn,
information.
Conflict with your neighboring countries. There are lots of reasons we don't think it's fair for them to lump everyone into be corrupt and ineffective. They then tell us that because these countries, just assuming that premise, are all evil and all want to buy guns and show off to their public, that they're going to have really militaristic aid campaigns. We don't think this is the case. There's no incentive for these governments to always give them guns. And if that is the big concern, then we can just give them the aid in the form of food already so that they can't do those things in the first place. We also don't think that our aid has to look like the US government bringing in helicopters. If that's their issue with militaristic aid, then we just won't do it the way that they want to. Lastly, we think on both sides of the house, both teams are going to only give aid to the NGOs that, as they say, have good track records and can prove that they're doing it well. Similarly, if a government is really corrupt and ineffective and have a terrible track record, we won't give them aid. It is a very simple premise. So
information
conflicts with their whole idea of egalitarian aid, because we think that is hinged on the practical of having good, effective aid in the first place. Then we told you on top of that, we gave you some structural reasons that we don't think were well responded to from our first speaker in the first place. She told you about how fundraising exists with NGOs uniquely, and that huge amounts of money are wasted on this, trying to attract private donors or trying to compete with other NGOs to get your government contract or however. This was unresponded to. So on their side of the house, even if equal money exists, a lot of theirs is wasted on putting up flashy banners. But then we also gave you some structural reasons as to why long-term aid doesn't exist. Sure, short-term aid, maybe some NGOs are better at it, and we're happy to support them as well. But when it comes to long-term things like setting up a robust education or healthcare system that requires deep collaboration with the government, we think it's just
information.
Put it directly in the hands of the government so they can do things like coordinate city planning, put what bridges where, connect what towns where, and put things in an order of priority. Make sure that the governments and the NGO aren't duplicating each other's work and then wasting money. Making sure you can allocate teachers to the right public school the way that it needs to be. All of these things are long-term goals that are crucial to a country's development that NGOs can't do on their side of the house. Even if they do try to do things like build schools and build clinics, the moment a flashier problem arises, a bigger crisis in some other countries, they're likely to pull out their funding, those clinics fail, and you create the same cycle again. When a government has a investment to support sustainable development, we think that's less likely to have to happen. We demand a response from them. Sure.
Okay, so going back to your earlier point about how to resolve our concern about corrupt governments, you just wouldn't have governments give money to corrupt governments. If there were suffering, vulnerable people under those corrupt dictatorships, how does your side of the house help those people?
Your side of the house is going to have the same problem. You'll give some money to an NGO, the corrupt government will say, hey, if you want to operate in our country, you have to give us 90% of the money you gave. It's equally the same thing. Like, the corrupt governments are bad on both sides of the house. Lastly, on the last piece of rebuttal, the idea of having goals. They told us that they're only going to give NGOs they're only going to give aid to NGOs that can prove that they're doing good work. The issue is, however, our definition of good work differs depending on who it is. When the person you're seeking approval from is a foreign government or the foreign public, you have a very different incentive to when you are accountable to the people you are directly helping in your country who are voting for you. That means, and this is, by the way, is all stuff Madeline told you that we, again, don't think that they responded to. The idea that they promote this idea of a white savior complex, they promote the idea of it's more important that we help you directly and we give you, for example, a school as opposed to teaching you how to build schools or teaching you how to build hospitals or whatever it is, or training doctors and medical professionals in that area. We told you that that is so much worse on their side when they don't have sustainable development. On top of that, we think on their side of the house, they're less likely to cooperate with people who live there and take into account what they feel they need to prioritize. Lastly, then, on substantive, on why we think hostility from governments gets so much worse. Sorry, my eyes twitching. Okay, why is this the case? Because we think in the status quo, a lot of countries are already reliant on aid from foreign governments. When onto that proposition, they pull that aid out, it creates a lot of anger, it creates a lack of trust. They promote that idea of Western imperialism with just one of two outcomes. Firstly, in some cases, especially countries that already have a bad colonial history with these countries, you are much more likely to just amplify that and seem to think and push the idea that we don't trust you to make your own decisions. Instead, we would rather have a Western-controlled organization come in and do it for you. That simply means that these countries are going to have active hostility towards these NGOs, refuse to let them in, and have propaganda campaigns that say that the West is bad, the West doesn't trust us, the West is pulling out money that they gave us a long time ago. Secondly, however, even if they do let these people in, they're less likely to cooperate with them. They feel that they're competing with them. For example, if these NGOs are going to pay their public teachers a lot better, that they're going to lose social workers out to them. As a result, that fear of competition and that fear of a lack of trust means that they aren't going to do things like share data. They aren't going to do things like share how you're going to plan the city, how you're going to have, for example, give protection to NGO workers in unsafe areas. All of this means that on their side of the house, the people they most want to help are villainized. On their side of the house, they fail the most vulnerable.
I thank the opposition second speaker for her speech and invite the proposition third speaker to close out the substantive argument for side prop. Hear, hear.
Okay, am I audible? And I would prefer non-real POI, so just like wave your hand in front of the camera and I'll hold you up or wave you down. In order for team opposition to meaningfully gain a lead within today's round, they must have been able to prove that for some reason, a government which has ideological opposition to another government will suddenly ignore all of that and say, you know what, I guess I'll give them blank checks to help their people instead. Well, we told you that NGOs are always more likely to do this at the point in which they're viewed as independent actors who are in charge of giving specific aid as opposed to giving like blank checks to the government. At that point, they can never access giving any true funding and any true humanitarian aid to the nations that are most in need. Thus, I'm so proud to stand on team proposition. In this speech, I'll be doing a couple of things. First, going over framing, then addressing the third stance come out of the opposition two. They give you 2 points of clash, showing why team proposition is so far ahead in today's round. Now, they wait until the opposition two to give like a little fiat refutation as to why we can't assume that like donations to NGOs will be unconditional. But the problem here is that this simply isn't a fiat. It's just how things work in the status quo. I can't go to the Red Cross and be like, you know what, I'll give you $100 if you donate to like this one specific hospital in Houston. That's simply not how NGOs work. You simply give donations to these organizations and they do what they will with the money. It was far too late in the O2, and even that was never going to be sufficient. Secondly, then on framing, we would argue that today's world, or that today's debate isn't about like changing the way in which NGOs or in which international aid functions, but it's about like which one should be preferred in the way that they exist in the status quo. I.e., they have to support saying that the U.S. government will do the exact things that they're doing right now because that is what international aid looks like. While we were saying that we would support giving greater funding to allow NGOs to do what they already do in the status quo, their like little fiat counter in the op2 simply wasn't sufficient. Third and finally, then I think that they failed to respond like adequately to what Susanna told you in the first speech on framing. Right, our world doesn't have like the current amount of funding that goes to NGOs because its funding is currently split between international aid and NGOs. At the point at which international aid no longer exists, there will be significantly more funding going to NGOs. This is extremely important, and I'll flag this a little bit later within the 2 points of clash. Before getting into those points of clash and before getting to third substantive, I'll take that point.
Given that NGOs inherently operate within confines that have immediate crises, is it more or less likely that NGOs leave behind unsustainable projects in stable countries when they move to a new country?
Okay, I was going to address this in the second point of clash, and I'll flag it then, but to get to it right now, I would argue that if your analysis is true as to why like donors mean that NGOs have to like do certain things, if donors suddenly find out that NGOs are like leaving projects half done, if they aren't truly helping people they're supposed to help, nobody will ever donate to these NGOs in the first place, right? There's a very strong accountability mechanism, which we told you both in our first two speeches, which you never truly responded to, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So first, let's address this third substantive on hostility. Note that Susanna largely presented this analysis coming within the proposition one, right? Because in order for it to be true that like people view will view Western nations as hostile for pulling aid, this is first contingent upon aid existing within those countries in the first place. We give you specific analysis as to why this is never likely to be the case, right? We told you that most often countries who are in need of aid are nations which have been previously like colonialized or oppressed by these countries. For example, look at Pakistan and India directly refusing to accept aid from Britain because of their colonial history. At that point, they're never going to have true access to this argument if there was already a negative perception in these countries of the West, and thus they never received aid from the West in the first place. But secondly, we would tell you that like they ignore the other thing that Susanna told you in the one, which is that NGOs, the reason NGOs are so preferable is because they are more flexible as opposed to like international aid. Because international aid always involves two governments. First, the government giving the aid, and secondly, the government receiving the aid. The reason that NGOs will always be preferable is because they're more flexible in the way that they're able to either go directly to the people of the nation and provide that aid, i.e. building school, i.e. building food banks and giving food directly to the people, or in the case of the government is effective and efficient in distributing aid, they're able to work directly with that government in order to effectively distribute the aid. At that point, they lose a large amount of their offense, right? Because that means that they're going to have, that we get like the best of their world when NGOs are able to work with the government in the case that they are efficient and effective, but in their role, in the case that the governments fail to be effective, they will never be able to distribute this aid directly to the people. Moving on then to the 2 points of clash in today's round. First, we're going to ask the question, what countries receive aid? And secondly, we're going to question which world has higher quality of aid, assuming that aid is provided. This first point of clash is going to be extremely important because it is quite literally a prerequisite to any material improvement to the quality of life in those in need. If we are able to prove that aid is unlikely to happen in the opposition world, they will never gain access to improving the lives of the people who need help the most. So first, you have to ask questions like, on this point of clash, who is this aid offered to? What did opposition tell you here? They told you two key things. First is going to be like or three key things. They said first is going to be like decreased funding to international aid, something that political interests mean that like certain nations will only donate to certain causes or give certain caveats. And third, that if countries like are negative, they simply won't give them aid. Why is it so problematic? Why is it never going to be enough? First, never characterize like exactly how it is political. If I'm giving money to the Red Cross, that's not like a political gesture. That's not saying like I support your ideology. Just saying, hey, I think that people probably need medical assistance. That's not truly political. Secondly, they never characterize to you, or they never respond to our analysis to why their world will always be more political, right? Because if I'm giving like aid to the Venezuelan government, that is more directly to like conservatives and moderates as an aim of saying like I support socialism, I support Venezuelan socialism, even if it's not really socialism. That's what people are going to believe, right? That's always going to be a more political gesture as opposed to giving money directly to NGOs. Third and finally, we argued that there's going to be that whenever there's like less of a tie between donation to certain governments and political interest, there will always be more donations, because as of now, conservatives and moderates will never support giving like certain international aid to nations they perceive as being socialist, communist, or like anything that's anti-American. In the absence of this political interest, whenever a third party, an independent NGO is doing this instead, there will always be more increased donations, because they will say, hey, I'm helping people in need, not, hey, I'm giving money to the Venezuelan government. At that point, there will always be increased support for increasing funding to these aids. So this analysis was given to you already within the first substantive in Susanna's speech, but they never truly responded. So what was our comparable material, and why does it put us so far ahead? We told you two key things here. First, that political boundaries will always be an obstacle to nations in need receiving aid. Look at what we told you in the look at what Susanna told you, right? The United States purposely like refused to give aid to Chile and Argentina simply because they were socialists. Once they were like overtaken by right-wing and neoliberal coups, that's when they decided to give humanitarian aid. This always gets in their world because there are political boundaries. Secondly, because even assuming that there are like some type of that there is some aid given is often came with caveats. I expound on this a little bit later, but as of now, this most often looks like the United States going into Indonesia and going into Indonesia and telling them we will give you aid on the condition that you adopt long-term neoliberal policies, which most often benefit United States multinational corporations. But then the second layer here was about who accepts aid. So there's a couple of things here, and they never truly responded until the op, but this was op 2, which is simply never going to be enough. We told you two key things here. First, that corrupted governments simply won't want to accept aid, and secondly, because of anti-Western sentiment. First, we would tell you that these governments likely won't accept aid simply because like they view that the government giving aid is negative, and thus they simply won't want to accept it. At that point, only we give material quality or improvement to the quality of life of people. Secondly, then on quality of aid, this is extremely important, right? Because even if we somehow lose this point of class, we would argue that we better access short-term and long-term improvement in quality of life. All they truly told you here was that NGOs like prioritize short-term interests, but it's simply never going to be enough, right? Because what we told you was extremely simple. First, that donors provide accountability, because if NGOs aren't improving the quality of life of people, they simply won't get funding. The government individuals will fund other people. Secondly, we would argue that there's, even if it's true that donors like are bad, we like decrease the dependence on donors, because now it is independent, or now it's governments giving the vast majority of donations to these people. Thirdly, we would say that they largely mischaracterize what like NGOs look like, because most often NGOs do prioritize both short-term and long-term. This is like UNESCO building schools and cultural centers within nations, because understand this is an extremely part of culture and overall accountability. At that point, we would argue that only we're going to be able to give like a substantive like improvements in quality of life, because we prioritize both short-term and long-term, and because we skip the actor, which are negative, ineffective, or corrupt governments. Only we provide aid. Only that aid is beneficial in our world. So proud to propose.
I would like to thank the proposition third speaker for their speech and invite the opposition third speaker to close out the substantive arguments for the opposition side. Hear, hear.
The US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, a global issue, after citing the fact that the Paris Agreement disproportionately helped their political enemies. Now, the Paris Agreement is very similar to these global organizations that proposition support. They generally support a certain issue and act in the entire interest of the world. So why then did the US pull out? It's because politicians employed rhetoric which said, if there's a chance that this money can go towards people we don't like, we don't want to be involved in it at all. Given that they never engage with our analysis as to why these politicians would still be unwilling to give to their political opponents in their world, they're far behind in this debate. I have three clashes for you today. Firstly, how much money is given in foreign aid in the first place. Because even if a proposition can make sure that their world is more egalitarian and more fair, they have to also make sure that the aid they give in the first place is more at face value than ours. And we tell you repeatedly that they're going to get the same extremely negligible amounts of aid. What did they say to this? They said that, well, get less aid because countries like the US are afraid of giving aid to North Korea because they could turn that aid into military power. Two responses to this. First of all, it is not clear why this is worse than the comparative. Sure, the US doesn't give aid to North Korea, but they do give aid to many other countries. And they have to prove why they will still do that in their world. They can't just say, well, they don't give money to every country in the world. This solution is unsustainable. Secondly, this logic doesn't even make sense. You can give aid, which is already translated. You can give aid in the form of food, and you can give aid in the form of sending workers to build infrastructure. How are they going to a road or a school into an ICBM? In what world can you convert this aid into military power? They need to link that. Like, exactly how does preventing their population from starving make them existential threat to your country? No, thank you. Furthermore, this logic is further enforced on their side, because if they are really so afraid of contributing to these people, then they're not going to give to these global funds in the first place. We argue that proposition gets significantly less donation to global organizations because now governments no longer have incentives to give foreign aid. First of all, intuitively, the reason global organizations deter governments from giving aid is because you are more happy to donate if you know who you are donating to. People wouldn't be convinced to donate if you ask them to give generally to solve poverty or solve global issues. The impact you can have there is vague and nebulous at best. So as a government, you're not going to have any pressure from your voter base to give aid. In a sec, you're much more likely to care if a specific issue was identified. Your money is supporting a village and preventing them from starvation. Your money is contributing to women's rights in a certain nation. Your money is contributing to preventing the genocide of a certain people. Voters won't think it's their problem if they find out that their tax dollars is going generally to solving global issues, the POI.
Okay, if voters think that it is so ridiculous that humanitarian aid that they give to a country could be used for that country's military program, then won't they also think it's ridiculous if humanitarian aid is given to a peaceful NGO that NGO will help out the military programs of other countries?
Oh, how that argument works is if the judges buy that indeed giving aid to these countries leads to them being more powerful militarily, then they won't give aid in the first place. If this argument doesn't fly, then there's no reasons for governments not to give aid in our world. So in either world, we still come out on top. Secondly, we said that governments would be afraid to giving aid to their political opponents. I've already talked about this, but it's just extremely likely for political figures to employ inflammatory rhetoric. All it takes is for Trump to say all the money is going to Mexico and China, and there the public support for it is gone. Populist politicians can twist these global organizations to look like skewed organizations and therefore act in their own incentives to spend that money elsewhere, such as military and such as other things that would garner them more votes overall. As a whole, they lose the majority of financial aid when they don't allow governments to give based on political incentives, because the majority of foreign aid is given on political incentives in the first place. It's not clear why you want to give to someone you don't even agree with. Madeline, and on the second clash in terms of long-term development, and I'd like to note that this point is extremely important. They have to show us why their change is sustainable and can support these countries outside from just keeping them above the baseline of starvation. Madeline and Jenna already argued this. I'm just going to be impacting it and showing you why it puts them even further behind in this debate. We said a few things. First of all, we said the type of developments from governments are better because of their unique incentives. Secondly, we told you that governments are more accountable. Each of these things in order. Firstly, incentives of governmental organizations are far worse than governments because governmental organizations only have to support a vague notion of ethicality from the global community. This means so long as they don't receive any major form of backlash, they're going to continue to be supported to the same extent. That means all they have to do in, like, let's say a city in Africa is make sure that the people in America aren't upset with the state of that city in Africa rather than the citizens of Africa itself. And that means that the government's incentives are inherently tied to their voters. The government of Africa is far more likely to be influenced by the people of Africa than people overseas. And we tell you that then this leads to as Madeline said, democratic incentives make it so that governments are far more incentivized to make long-term sustainable change. Because if schools are no longer functional, if healthcare is no longer functional, your population presumably is going to be kind of upset, and it's going to be your fault. So no matter how corrupt you are, you can't stop a revolution. If your people start starving to death, you can't turn them into soldiers. So it's not clear why exactly a country being corrupt is a winning case for them in the first place. But furthermore, they only consider this debate in the terms of corrupt countries. Presumably, corrupt countries are a minority, and there are far more countries that actually care about their population, which is why the global affairs are in the state they're in right now. Not that bad. So which means that if indeed governments care about their populations, which is true in most situations, they are going to have better incentives than foreign organizations, and thus they are more likely to build things like schools, like long-term things that contribute to the economy. A few more inherent incentives for this. Because they're not measurable, therefore that foreign organizations can't report on them. A foreign organization won't be able to measure the change of, let's say, implementing a school or strengthening the economy of a certain country, because those implications are vague and you can't report back. But if you are a government, you are going to see the results of these changes just in terms of the general happiness of your population. You don't get that same measurement on proposition side. Secondly, it's much more likely for foreign organizations to pursue symbolic change. This is to say, change which sates people, but doesn't necessarily make the life of these people better. You're going to keep them barely off the line, like the line of ethical, horrendousness, but not ever try to create any meaningful change within their country. Lastly, we'd like to discuss an integrated solution, because note that opposition is far more nuanced than Gov in the sense that we can integrate both funding to governments and funding from private organizations. We're more than happy to have NGOs give things like food and medicine, because that type of stuff is extremely easy to do. But we're not happy with them building schools or implementing local social policy or social initiatives, because their cultures are fundamentally different from these cultures within these local areas. And that means that they're probably not familiar with these areas. They're going to cause issues within the local city. And this has happened multiple times because NGOs aren't experts in the area, the government are. Team US, make sure that everybody has the same aid. But by making sure everybody has the same aid, they neglect what type of aid they get, whether this aid is useful for them in the long term, or whether they get the same amount of aid as us on whole in the first place.
I would like to thank the opposition third speaker for their speech and invite the opposition reply speaker to close out the opposition's case. Hear, hear.
Okay. Proposition tells us that a lot of governments are both evil and powerful. These are the types of governments that have these sick, twisted incentives to deny aid to people who are struggling because of some sort of political maneuver. These are the governments who are likely to take aid and use it for military purposes. But apparently, you know what neuters all those incentives? You know what neuters all that power? Oxfam. Because Proposition's case and conception of reality didn't hold up to the real world, we are so proud to take this debate. Two questions then in this reply. Firstly, how is that aid distributed? And in which world is that aid used more effectively? So firstly then on where that aid goes, because they told us that that aid is going to go everywhere. And we told you that's not the case, because the US does have a lot more leverage over Oxfam and Doctors Without Borders, meaning that they can dictate where that aid goes. And we told you that if you can't dictate where that aid goes, you're probably just not going to give aid at all, or you're going to drastically reduce it. We told you that governments and the public like having control over where their money goes, considering it is their taxpayer money that is technically supposed to go to their direct good. So the only way you would ever convince the public to actually spend money on other people who you will never meet is if you give them a specific narrative and you tell them that these are going to your allies, people who you consider kind of pseudo part of your country. When that money just goes to places, you have very little control over where that money goes. It means the public is never going to support significant spending over that money, especially if that money is going to go to your enemies or controversial countries. They then told us that in some cases that money is rejected because it's considered Western aid and they don't want to touch it because they don't want to be reliant on, for example, former colonial powers. But we told you that they will equally reject it on your side of the house, because already organizations like the UN are perceived to be Western organizations because the overwhelming amounts of political and financial power that they have. On their side of the house, just because you change the name of the aid, just because it no longer says it's coming from the UK and it's now coming from Red Cross, doesn't mean that countries are blind and governments are blind to the fact that it is coming from Western countries in the first place. Lastly, then, we told you that on their side of the house, a lot of countries are already dependent on this aid. And we told you this in our second argument and in our second speech, and they never responded to it. Therefore, cutting off that aid, giving it to someone else and telling them, we don't trust you to handle that money well, makes them hostile, makes them more likely to reject that aid in the first place. So on both sides of the house, either both teams are going to do it based off of good track records and whether or not that country is going to accept that aid, in which case we get equal distribution. However, on their side of the house, they're actually likely to get less distribution because they create that hostility, because they don't have public goodwill. Secondly, then, on the idea of who's going to spend that aid better. We told you from the beginning that a lot of that money that charities use actually goes to advertising, to get private donors, and to make sure governments choose them as the NGO they want to support. They gave us no response to the fact that massive amounts of money is going to be wasted. We then told you that for a lot of really important projects like education and like healthcare, that you need to collaborate with the government. And they actually conceded to this, which was really strange considering they characterized most governments as being really corrupt and really ineffective. On top of that, when you add in the fact that you have portrayed these governments as ineffective, when you have made them hostile towards you, that collaboration goes down the drain entirely. But let's say, hypothetically, they do manage to set up pull out, and that means that those situations are going to collapse and crumble. It is only after they have crumbled that they're able to go back in, meaning that you create the cycle of having to deal with the next new crisis, but never actually fixing one long enough that it never flares up again. Lastly, we told you, okay, fine. The aid is spent really, really well on whatever goal that they want to measure charities by. We told you that these are bad goals in the first place. We told you that a lot of when you are accountable to what other people think is best for you, instead of what those people think is best for them in the first place, you don't actually get good specialization and you don't get good regionalization. You get symbolic change. You get, for example, Western people thinking that, oh, building schools is good, so we should just build schools everywhere, without realizing that in some places that might not be what people want. And in some cases, you could build a school and have none of the students go there because education wasn't the issue. It was the fact that children had to work because they were so poor in the first place. At the end of the day, we think on our side of the house, if you want to help people develop, you have to trust them to make their own good decisions.
I would like to thank the opposition reply speaker for their speech and invite the proposition reply speaker to close out the debate. Here.
It is because in every speech throughout this debate, side opposition has taken the most optimistic possible characterization of local governments and the most pessimistic possible characterization of NGOs that they have lost this debate. In this debate, in this speech, I'll be doing comparative worlds analysis about what the world of the prop and the op looks like and showing you why every argument is a reason to vote for the proposition. Let's describe the opposition world. We see that in the status quo, public and international pressure for big countries to give aid will exist. In both sides of the house, there's going to be backlash if that does not occur. But if a government thinks that they can fulfill that obligation by giving aid in a way that is advantageous to them, then they are going to do that because their constitutive purpose is to benefit and protect their country. This means that any form of aid given from a government to another government will be given selectively to ideologically similar countries because governments can choose and because the money is going to foreign governments, which can be opponents, i.e. this is what happens when governments refuse to give aid to countries like Venezuela or Argentina because they are considered communist. This is the reason why governments should not be determining aid and categorizing humanitarian relief on the basis of who it is going to, because insofar as we are giving money to other governments, then we see not the people we are helping, but the state we are helping. And if, as they have pointed out, if the people of a country do not like another state, then they will not give aid to them. The way we should resolve that is by not giving money to a state, but rather giving money to the suffering people within that state who are detached from their political leader. It also means that any aid that is given will have strings attached. Think about how Chinese developmental assistance that starts out as humanitarian comes with strings of adherence to the BRI later on. Think about how adherence to US aid initially for protection and assistance largely spills up to larger basing programs throughout the Middle East and North Africa. We see that this means that the quality of aid in the long term, which is what they care to claim so much about, is intrinsically negative and leads to to more conflict and crisis in the long term by creating long-term instability that is only beneficial to large superpowers that do not care about the interests of other states. But even if this all was not the case, we see that when money goes to foreign governments, that money isn't used very well. All of our analysis about corruption, sure, this doesn't apply to all states or even a majority, but insofar as several major conflicts right now, i.e. humanitarian crises in Syria and Venezuela, are both held accountable by governments that do not have the interests of their citizens at heart, we see that this is a very legitimate concern. And after events like natural disasters, we see that it is unlikely that even optimistic, kind governments are going to have the necessary infrastructure and capabilities to help their people, even with assistance, which was why we should have trained professionals from organizations like Oxfam doing that work instead. We also see, insofar as this aid would be given by NGOs without earmarking, because in our model we made it very clear the earmarking would not be allowed, that creates an incentive for governments to fulfill their principled obligation for egalitarian distribution rather than distribution motivated by national interest, which was a principled argument that just hasn't been contested throughout this debate. Now, what does the world of the comparative look like? We say NGOs are better for a couple of reasons. Firstly, in terms of incentive structures, NGOs aren't motivated by some vague form of ethicality. Their purpose is to increase the well-being of vulnerable people in specific regions that they are operating in. If they do not accomplish that and increase well-being by creating new infrastructure, rectifying problems, then they don't receive funding. That's how they work. This is far more objective than general ideas of satisfying the people or happiness that supposedly exist under some select benevolent governments on their side of the house. We also see that a large quantity of money is given to NGOs in the world of the proposition. First, because the resolution asks where the money should go, not whether it will go to NGOs. But secondly, because politicians can't spin giving money to an NGO that is directing 85% of its funds to earthquake relief as funds that are going to go to the Chinese military. We think the only world in which people would be unlikely to give aid to another government is if money is going to the government itself, which is why we should use NGOs as the middleman. So insofar as money is going to the countries we need it, we see that insofar as NGOs have an incentive for long-term progress, because removing all of their infrastructure from countries is just going to lead to a negative image in the eyes of the public insofar as they are trained. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to aid, but rather they will do it on a country-by-country basis as they do it in the status quo. We see that trained organizations like NGO are better than the corrupt practices of governments on both sides. For all these reasons, we urge a proposition ballot. Thank you.
I would like to thank the proposition reply speaker for their speech. With that speech, that now concludes this round for the quarterfinals. Thank you, debaters on both ends of the table. I think I speak for all the judges when I say it was quite a good debate. We've probably got a bit of work on our hands. Judges, I believe we need to deliberate. I'm not sure where we're meant to do that. So let me just double check and I'll let you guys know as soon as I know.
Thanks to
so
Team
much.
USA and thank you to our judges. Thank you. It's a fun round.
Good round, guys.
Thanks.
Okay, for the judges in the room, I've been told that what I need is your calls just sent to me privately by Discord. So when you guys have had a chance to think and weigh up the debate, just send me a private message with your decision, and then I'll invite the debaters back.
And it should probably include also the reasoning, right? Why we decided to give it to that side.
Yeah, absolutely. If you could just write like 1 or 2 lines around why you gave it that way, that would be really helpful.
Sure, makes sense. Thank you.